My name is Anthony Amato. The name of my book is The Carpathians, the Hutsuls, and Ukraine in Environmental History. My book looks at people and nature in one area of the Carpathian Mountains. This is one of the most diverse parts of Europe, biodiverse parts of Europe. 1/3 of all species found in Europe are found in the Carpathians. There are almost no other areas of Europe like that. And the Hutsul region, because of people and nature, has an exceptional diversity, even within that diversity. About the only species that I can think of offhand that is in other parts of the Carpathians and not in the Hutsul region is the chamois goat antelope. And we'll have to do this interview with kid gloves, I guess, because the goat antelope is not found in the Hutsul region, but almost all of the species found in the Carpathians show up in this small area of the northeastern Carpathians. Why I wrote the book. In my work, I should now say almost decades ago, on my dissertation, I pointed in the direction of environmental history. And environmental history at that point was still inchoate. It was still the developing field. And over time, as I became more acquainted with environmental history and the scholars doing environmental history, I found new ways of looking at the Hutsul region and new topics that I could study. I wasn't just studying the mountains as something that limited the people living there or gave them bounty, but I was studying complex interactions where people and nature had a conversation with each other, or to put it in more adversarial terms, where people and nature took measures against each other and the other party responded with countermeasures. And a good deal of this simply unfolded without much record in the past, and finding those records is key. I hope that my book can help people think more deeply about place and also about the relationship between human beings and nature in all of its forms. After all, people are part of nature, they came from nature, but it seems that in the study of much of what we would call Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the former Soviet states, there isn't a lot of acknowledgement of place and the variety of nature and people's experience in it. Initially, it was the abolition of manorial obligations that Hutsuls had to perform for landlords, whether that landlord be a private landlord or the state, the crown land of Galicia. They lived in the crown land of Galicia. And with the abolition of manorial obligations, we have the rise of full-fledged capitalism in the region. And that capitalism tied the Hutsuls to markets and distant agents of procurement of resources in ways that they had never been tied before. They had been slowly entering a vast global market system for centuries, but after 1848, the world took a turn toward more intense exploitation of the mountains and far more opportunities for Hutsuls in terms of earning money and securing their place in the mountains and transforming the mountains. A second reason is that we enter the age of anthropogenic climate change. The little ice age is over in 1850, roughly thereabouts, and we enter our present age, which some would call the Anthropocene, where one of the large drivers becomes anthropogenic climate change. And anthropogenic climate change, in all probability, brought more disastrous events to the mountains, but it also eased Hutsuls' entry to higher elevations. It kept a very cold, damp area of, it made a very cold, damp area of the world a little warmer and a little more conducive to their efforts to claim the bounty of the land. Yes, I did extensive research in Ukraine's archives in early Ukraine during that very tough period. This was a long time ago, and that research actually is still something I can pick up and look at in new ways. That was also the age of the early internet, and I remember some young person saying, "Oh, you must use the internet a lot to do your research." And I said, "No, not at all," because at that point the internet was just these standalone web pages. But in the past 2 decades, what has happened is, especially in the past decade, there has been an explosion of primary sources that have been put on the web as PDFs, or that interesting Polish format déjà vus, and that has enabled me to look at many primary sources that I didn't even know existed and consult them after just an afternoon of clicking around on the internet. That just sounds so cheap and easy compared to what I was involved in at the beginning of my research, when it was a product of months, days, and Ukrainian holidays. And another thing I will say is, to do this project, I had to become someone who could read and appreciate biology, especially botany and ecology. And that was a key part of training for this, is taking on a training that involves really reading to become conversant and understanding in biology and ecology in a way that I wasn't when I graduated from the university with just one course in biology. As a point of departure, I'll start with a Ukrainian scholar, Eustace Voloshchak, or Євстахій Волощак. He's one of the lesser known botanists of the late 19th century. And what he discovered is that a forest, in the form that it existed in the late 19th century, was actually suppressing local biodiversity in many areas. And human beings, by deforesting the mountains, were opening space for grasses and flowering plants and all that these species, which are producers, could bring with them. And so this was one way the Hutsuls operated to bring about greater biodiversity on a local scale in the mountains. In addition to that, the Hutsuls also were people who brought a lot of baggage with them, everything from weeds to cats to sparrows relied on people's activities, whether those activities be disturbing or just putting up space where a bird could nest. All of those things created greater biodiversity. And on top of it, we have to say that the Carpathian species themselves were working toward biodiversity independent of people all the time, night and day. So we can credit people's activities for the near extinction of many species, but we can say also that species had been evolving and showing up in the mountains for eons prior to people's inhabitation. So we can only really begin to appreciate that this understanding people as being agents in terms of natural creation. And when we think about nature, nature is also an agent of its own creation. It has always been the case that there were external authorities that had tremendous influence. There were laws on forestry going back to Joseph II in the 1780s, and that prevented them from engaging in many activities. Now, one of the key things that happened in the period that I like to focus on is a decree by Austria in 1859 that there be no net loss of forest, even on private land. So those who held private land had to plant a tree for every tree they took, or plant many trees for every tree they took. And the Hutsuls were always there with regulations from external authorities, yet they exercise their own autonomy by putting their cattle in pastures that they were not supposed to put their cattle on, by going into forests and taking a few trees for their firewood need. And in my broader vision, my work doesn't just start in 1848. It goes back centuries prior to 1848 and comes right up to the present to show this conversation between local users and external authorities. The Soviet authority was, in many people's eyes, the authority that shaped the region, but pre-totalitarian powers did a lot of regulation too, and they controlled most of the land. This was not an area where the Hutsuls wandered and found freedom from external authorities. Rather, external authorities were intimately involved in people's lives from early settlement up, of course, until the present. But different authorities had different visions, and not all authorities could exercise supervision in the same way. Why I go so far back into the past, before 1848, and why I come up to the present is really to show nature's possibilities and acts in the distant and near pasts that limited those possibilities, both for people and for nature. You bring up oil, and that's a very big issue today. At what point will oil prices rise to a level when large multinational corporations will be able to frack the Carpathians profitably? When I was there wandering in 1994, we came across a scene from the opening of the Beverly Hillbillies television series where there was crude just on the surface of a wetland. And that area is endowed with natural gas and oil. Most of it was taken out in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It became sub-economic, but with directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing and rising appetite for oil, I think it's only a matter of time before people will face a difficult decision about fracking. Deforestation has been the larger issue. As recently as this spring, there was a terrible scandal, one of many, where IKEA was caught purchasing items made in Transcarpathia from Hutsul wood, and that wood had been taken supposedly sustainably under the guise of sanitary forestry, where you're able to take fallen trees and trees that are growing too close to make the forest more healthy, as though forests even had an understanding such as health. But that's an important point, but we'll let that point sit for a moment. But back to the point, deforestation is now the major challenge throughout the chain, and it could reach levels as it did in the 1930s, where deforestation begins to reduce biodiversity rather than increase it on both a chain-wide scale and on a local scale. So in thinking about these possibilities, they all are perils that loom over the mountains. I must say, though, that if anything, the past of the mountains indicates they're unpredictable zigzags, and we are coming up probably on a zigzag. Whether we will zig or zag it depends on a lot. And I'm using we, and I should be very clear that I'm not a local stakeholder in the mountains, but yet my use, whether it's going to IKEA or filling up my automobile, is in a sense a vote for which direction the mountains will take, and what industries will thrive, what industries will dominate. And I want to, just make very clear that all of this is unfolding in the still under-regulated environment of Ukraine that's possibly bigger than multinational corporations. Is Ukraine's under regulation, and it's not just at the top, it is at the local level too. An environment where people operated for so long based on personal connections cannot be overturned overnight. And in that way, I'm talking about something that seems human, all too human, and it seems far from the environment. But keep in mind that we're a social species as humans, and we're hardwired to want personal connections. And often with those personal connections come actions, and those actions can take a whole region down a different pathway. So nature shows up there too. But the real action on the ground involved Swidden cultivation, where people are deforesting areas, burning the brush, and using the ashes from the brush to make the soil fertile enough to grow crops for 2 or 3 years, and then that land has to be abandoned, and they're opening new pasture land to sell for themselves, for sheep and cattle, by engaging in the same activity. And part of the activity involves girdling trees, simply cutting rings around trees, causing them to die. You might ask, well, why can't they just chop down the tree from the beginning? Well, human energy stores and human numbers in the Carpathians were limited, as they are in many places, and the Hutsuls were actively working throughout this period to take down much forest in order to engage in cultivation, but more so to engage in animal husbandry. They wanted more land for meadows and pastures. It was too bad for them that at every point in every place during that period, the land was somebody's property, even their own property. And in this chapter, I get into a whole set of processes that transformed the land. And the final process is the process of sprucing up the Carpathians. The foresters of Austria, driven by the 1859 decree, knew that they needed to reforest a deforested area. And some of those deforested areas were in the Hutsul region. So they went out and planted many trees by the thousands, seeding kilogram after kilogram of seed and punching in thousands of seedlings. And the successful species in that whole episode and up until the present day in Ukraine is Picea abies. That's the Norway spruce or the white spruce. It's a fast-growing tree that simply outgrew its competition. It was easy to plant, and in that way, the Carpathians were spruced up. They literally took on a whole new cover over the second half of the 19th and 20th century, and that was a spruce cover. More of the Carpathians in the Hutsul region is treed or covered by forest today than it was in the 1850s, but the trees are very different. They are spruces. So I couldn't resist in using a title to get at the process of literary title, but then also a title that was overly literal, because we think sprucing up, they were cleaning up, they were tidying up, but in a sense they were planting spruces. That was part of their effort as part of a grander deforestation of Ukraine that resulted in a larger reforestation of that part of Ukraine. And you can ask, why is he using this term Ukraine for most of the period? It was not part of a state that was part of Ukraine. Well, I'm inviting readers to think about the notion that Ukraine consists of places. And Ukraine, if anything, consisted of people with very close connections to places. Those places were not always kind to the people who lived there. And people in the past were not always kind to the places where they lived. And that had ramifications up to the present day. So the region is more spruced than it probably ever has been in the last 1,000 years in the Hutsul region. And if we go far back, millennia, softwoods, conifers, the spruces were in great number. And then more recently, during the historic period, starting with Kievan Rus, the shift was toward hardwood communities as part of a natural succession process. And these included oak trees and beech trees. And one might ask, well, how do we know about that? Well, we do have pollen records. We also have people who cut down trees in the past and counted the rings and new tree composition through tree rings. And then more recently, closer to the present, we have records of people describing the forest. So in a sense, the re-sprucing of the Carpathians comes after a long period when hardwoods thrived, oaks and beeches in particular. But those oaks and beeches had desirable characteristics and were extremely slow growing. So they suffered people's needs. They also suffered their own natural limits. And because of that, spruces, after millennia of losing ground, really regained ground in just a century and a half. And the trees were really the anchors of whole ecosystems, whole forest ecosystems. There are very few areas in the Hutsul region that are old growth forest, and those areas are dominated by oaks and beeches, primarily beeches, and they occasionally have a few silver firs in them as well. First of all, there is a study of health going on conducted by U.S. scholars of Ukrainian displaced persons in North America, and they're trying to really look at this population and get a sense of health and longevity. But for me, I came to know how short and miserable Hutsul's lives were by page after page of parish registers with nothing but dead babies. And the elderly Hutsuls we often think of are the spry Hutsuls of my age and older. They were survivors of a very short life expectancy. Interestingly enough, mountaineers' life expectancy was longer than the life expectancy of Ukrainian peasants on the plains in Galicia. And that still remains a mystery. Possibly the plains had more contact with epidemics that took so many people in the past, and the life of the plains involved hard labor for women that actually caused them to miscarry. That's an area that can be explored. I do explore infant mortality and epidemics in this book, and this is key to understanding people because people have a reproductive imperative and they suffer various causes of death. Those too are part of nature. They're part of human nature. And importantly, in all of this, we have to really ask, well, what are the numbers? What did the data say? And the data say that Hutsuls and other Ukrainian peasants had an awful life of childhood mortality. And after that period from infancy through mid-childhood, maybe they had a shot at reaching old age. But most people in most of the past lived very short and miserable lives. The Hutsuls lived unusually miserable lives. Their life expectancy was as low as anyone's is in the world today. What happened between now and then was there's been an epidemiological revolution based on vaccines and based on public health that has given us this enormous boost in life expectancy. And that's changed our relationship to the environment. Yes, the Prut River is the main river, and that is the actual river that shows up in Bram Stoker's Dracula as part of speculation as to how the Count floated his boat. In other words, his coffin on his way to reach England. And the Prut River is the major river. It's fed by the Cheremosh rivers, and it's fed by numerous small tributaries. And rivers were a key part of this book. They are continually acting night and day. They were bringing calamity in the form of floods, but yet those same floods deposited soils that the Hutsuls were able to use in a land of steep slopes and spruces that provided almost nothing for cultivation. And on top of it, they provided fresh water as well. And so rivers are a key part of the history of the region, even though there are mountains, and we think about the mountains as being the story. It might be the rivers and the watersheds that are the story of the people, because moving along the rivers is easy. Just an aside, where they go really wrong in the Blair Witch Project is when they don't follow the river to civilization. And Hutsuls were always trekking along the river and up the river for centuries, and only recently have they actually been crossing over ridges. And I should really, wrap this up by saying that rivers were lifelines, but they were also death lines too, as well, as this year has shown with its flooding. Build too close to the river, try to cross a river that's swollen, and there's death. That even came out in Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. I don't know whether you know that, but the supposed great Hutsul story, of course, has drowning in it as a cause of death. And many Hutsuls drown in swollen rivers or in efforts to cross rivers, fording them at places they should not have been forded. I would say, first of all, they have to realize that cultural influences made the region what it was in terms of its biologic richness. People's Swidden cultivation, people's introduction of large numbers of cattle and sheep had an impact on making the river rich, making the country rich and biodiverse. Therefore, keeping those activities is important. Closing off any part of the Carpathians or anywhere in the world to keep people out of that area is a questionable proposition. Sometimes that should be done to protect areas, but alongside those protected areas, you need areas of long-standing cultural use. Again and again, that is what has produced a good deal of the biodiversity of the world. Another thing that I would say is regulation is key. That's an easy point for people to understand. In some cases, I would take the side of foresters with the Austrian and Polish forest services against local users who simply wanted to take as much wood as they wanted to sell or graze as many animals in the forest as they could. And third, I'd like to stress that protecting places is key. One great problem with the EU is the EU has become fixated on climate change and sustainability. In much EU environmental policy, care about places does not exist. And we might argue why that has come about. And my argument is that in the case of Europe, most of Europe has seen a heavy human hand on it for millennia. Whereas in the Carpathians, that human hand has not been so heavy, or nature has pushed against that human hand a lot more. So while the EU is often talking about specific quotas or specific goals in terms of carbon emissions and talking about this nebulous concept of sustainability, it's really important that people care about places as much or more, about the species and processes and activities that make them the places that they are. And if those activities cease, if those species vanish, and if those processes stop, they're no longer the same places. We're at this point, to use an expression known to those of us in Canada and Minnesota, we're skating on thin ice in the Carpathians. And we are really close to losing a lot if a number of the processes are allowed to go unchecked for 2 or 3 decades more, particularly species loss. This is an issue that I deal with in the conclusion of the book, and I leave people in the present day. This is a history, but yet I believe that all study of the past has to speak to the present. So I bring the book right up to the present day, and I say that we are in an uneasy resting place. We're teetering right now, and we can go in 2 directions. We can go toward biodiversity continuity and enrichment, or we can tumble down a slope and fall into a loss of species and a loss of processes. That really depends. It is perilous. One thing that I will say about climate change is that most scientists forecast the Carpathians will be less affected by climate change than many other areas around the Carpathians, and far more than other areas around the world. So the Carpathians might get a bit of a pass on climate change. The other thing too is I always have to look at this from a mat grass perspective. Mat grass was one of the grasses that expanded with people's activities in the Carpathians with animal husbandry. And I wonder, what would mat grass say to all of this? What would spruces say to all of this? And what would many different species that have thrived with intense human activity, even destructive human activity, say to all of this? What would stinging nettles say to all of this? In some cases, mat grass and spruces and blueberries would be quite happy about continued use. But even for them, we reach a point where they would be imperiled. But yet, species prove far more resilient and persistent than people. People go off and have revolutions now and then. People go off and get ideas that they should move to the city to have the good life. Plants, bacteria, other species, they're looking to find a place wherever they can, and they will find those places. So from the perspective of all living beings, we say that this would be a very different Carpathians. It would be a Carpathians that it would be a Carpathians that we wouldn't like if things went south, forgive the pun, but it might be a Carpathians that several species would love. I would definitely want to make sure that people understood the Hutsul region as a frontier that went through a series of openings and closings over the past 500 years. And with new orders came new types of frontiers. And these frontiers involve relationships with people and nature, people trying to produce what they could from nature. And these frontiers closed too. One of the most interesting things about the Soviet Union is we see a regulatory state come into being. And that state increases cultivation, while at the same time it increases forested area in the Hutsul region. So that it suggests that the Soviet state was not hell-bent on ecocide. That's a very important point. And within these mad Soviet pushes, there was ample space for Hutsuls to carry on as they had been carrying on for 500 years. The Soviet authorities left a great deal of open space in the Carpathians, and Hutsuls and their activities advanced into that space. That's very important because I feel that, again, the book needs to come up to the present day. And in present day Ukraine, what we've seen over the past 2 decades is the advance of tourism in the area, even more so than forestry, far more so than the prospect of petroleum. Tourism is driving the current Carpathians. Every Hutsul is building a cottage to rent out on Airbnb. That's hyperbole, of course, but many are, and that's become a big driver of land use in the region. Understanding the region's processes in the past and the agents in those processes is key to understanding what could be some of the outcomes of this new push toward tourism. Also, this book is an invitation for people to reconsider their own places and nature, no matter where they live and no matter how they define nature. Many people will never make it to the Carpathians. None of us can go back to the Carpathians in 1939 or 1848, much less 1994. But by taking a deeper look at your own surroundings, you can actually see many of the Carpathian agents that were integral in the story of the Carpathians. Not too far from here, I'm in southwestern Minnesota, we were out for a walk in a county park, and we noticed wormwood, and we had a wonderful discussion about wormwood and cattle grazing, and that's one of the species that showed up in the Carpathians, not to mention, learning how to tell a pine tree from a spruce tree from a fir tree can be an activity that really gives a person insight. We say that Ukraine is a country of peasants, but we don't often think about what those peasants were up to. We scheme up these ideas of agricultural stereotypes about plows and haymaking, but we don't really think about what did plowing involve. What did haymaking involve? What types of grasses were involved in flowering plants? And if anything, this book is first and foremost a call to reconsider the present through the past. There's a tremendous amount still to do, and I know of a few other scholars working in the area. I think in coming years, there'll be just an explosion of work. I can mention a few names: Olena Smetina in Odessa, also David Moon, the English scholar, and I should mention Adrian Sibriewski. I'm sorry, I have trouble when I don't see people's Ukrainian names spelled out in Ukrainian. Yeah, which is, I might have mispronounced his name, but they've all contributed works as of late. I want to stress that we can't forget the activity of Soviet scholars. These scholars were sometimes working in history, and Marxist materialism created a great deal of space for them to study the environment. And also Soviet scholars had a great deal of leeway in biology after the fall of Trofim Lysyenko. I give him the Russian pronunciation of his name because I think that's what he would have wanted to be called. But after Lysyenkoism, there was an explosion of Soviet work in biology. And after that period of collapse, younger Ukrainian scholars and a new generation of Ukrainian scholars and scholars across that part of Europe have gone forward and done phenomenal works in terms of knowing the natural environment in areas from botany to mycology. And I have to say that if anyone should express gratitude to anyone in post-Thanksgiving America, I'm expressing gratitude to a generation of scholars, or to several generations of scholars who laid the groundwork for environmental history. They made my work possible. My work would not be possible without generations of late Soviet scholars and also generations of Ukrainian scholars and scholars in the country around them. So I think, if anything, the picture for environmental history is hopeful, quite hopeful. Unlike the Carpathians, where there's a high risk of calamity, literally a high risk of calamity, mud flows and floods, but also a risk of dangerous environmental activity. Environmental history is going forward much like the variety of species of life that it studies, and it's going forward around the world, whether it has the name environmental history or not. I just wish your viewers all the best, and I want to commend you for the work that you are doing. I thought that one of my agents of publicity had contacted you, but in a sense, you're doing this on your own initiative. You're much like the wild species of the Carpathians, not waiting for cues from the people at the top, but taking your own initiative. And I want to thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing. When I looked through the playlist on the YouTube, I was impressed by the range of scholars that you have had on your programs, and I was equally impressed in the openness of your forum to people of a variety of viewpoints and interests. Many people simply want a story of Ukraine, where the story of Ukraine is something about something about a grand narrative, and those grand narratives matter, but there's a lot that matters, and guess what? There's a lot that is at work 24/7. So I really commend you on all of the work that you've done, and I express my gratitude to you. So thank you very much.